I am Miller Files, and every time I open an old case file, I can feel the weight of a story that never got to finish itself. Some cases are loud, filled with confessions, fingerprints, and scenes that leave no room for doubt. But some cases are made of silence, thin gaps in time where something irreversible happened, and no one has ever truly explained why. On the night of June 2nd, 2011, in Bloomington, Indiana, a 20-year-old woman named Lauren Spierer stepped into such a gap, and the world has not seen her since. To understand a disappearance like this, you don't start with the moment someone vanishes. You start much earlier, with the rhythm of a college town in summer, a campus that never sleeps, and a young woman who wanted nothing more than a simple night out with friends. Bloomington was warm that evening. Even after sunset, the air held that early June heaviness, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes the night feel alive. College bars were glowing like beacons, spilling music into the street and attracting students looking for release after exams. Among them was Lauren, small in stature but big in presence, with a personality bright enough to light up a room before she even spoke. Lauren had spent the day like she spent many others, getting ready for the night, meeting friends, and planning a short bar hopping route not far from her apartment. She had no enemies. She had no secret life. She was simply a student who believed she was stepping into a normal college night. But as every detective learns, ordinary nights can unravel in extraordinary ways when the wrong details combine. Her medical condition was one of those details. Lauren had long QT syndrome, a heart condition that could turn dangerous with alcohol or drugs or physical strain. It was not something she advertised, but the people close to her knew. They knew she was fragile in ways most 20-year-olds aren't yet that night. As Lauren moved between bars, she drank heavily, too heavily. By the time midnight blurred into early morning, her speech had softened, her balance weakened, and she began leaning on others to stay upright. From witness accounts, she was smiling, laughing, enjoying the night. But beneath that joy was vulnerability, and beneath that vulnerability was danger. A detective looks at patterns, and in this story, the pattern is simple. Lauren grew more impaired as the hours passed, while the number of responsible decisions around her grew smaller. Around 1:30 a.m., Lauren left a bar with a group of friends and headed toward the first apartment where she would spend part of the night. This apartment belonged to someone she knew. Cameras showed her stumbling, needing support to walk. She was barefoot by this point. Why she removed her shoes, or why she left them behind, is one of the early mysteries of the timeline. People don't walk away barefoot at night unless they are extremely intoxicated or extremely disoriented, or unless something persuades them to move when they shouldn't. Inside that apartment, she appeared relaxed. Music played softly. Friends moved casually between rooms. It was the kind of college space where everyone seemed comfortable enough to forget the world outside. But Lauren didn't stay long. Within minutes, she left again. This time without her phone. A phone is a lifeline. When someone walks away from their shoes, you worry. When they walk away from their phone, you start to think something is very wrong. Around 2:30 a.m., Lauren reached a second apartment, a place where 2 more men were staying. No alarms were raised. No one seemed especially concerned that she was heavily intoxicated. No one called for help when she reportedly fell and might have hit her head. Later, these same individuals would clarify, correct, or soften parts of their testimonies. But in the moment, no one took decisive action. They let the night unfold as though everything was normal. By the time 4:00 a.m. approached, Lauren was unstable on her feet, her coordination slipping in a way that was obvious. Yet, just after 4:15 a.m., she walked out the door of that apartment and into the empty Bloomington streets. A security camera captured her final confirmed appearance. A small figure, barefoot, unsteady, heading south. There were no other pedestrians, no traffic, just Lauren and a silence that would swallow her whole. When I review the footage, I always pause at the moment when she walks out of frame. There is no fear in her steps, no sprinting, no flinching, no sign that she sensed danger behind her. She simply walks away, unaware that she has seconds left in the recorded world before entering a void that more than a decade later we still cannot illuminate. The next morning, when Lauren's parents couldn't reach her, they knew instantly that something was wrong. Parents develop instincts stronger than evidence. They called friends. They called police. By the time the sun was fully up, the search had begun. Officers retraced her last known movements. They followed the camera footage. They questioned everyone who spoke with her that night. But here is where the story grows troubling. Those who had last seen Lauren quickly lawyered up. Their statements became short, rehearsed, cautious. They avoided speculation. They declined polygraphs. Their silence was legal, yes, but silence has weight in a case like this. Silence can close doors before investigators ever walk through them. I have opened hundreds of missing person files, but few have the strange emptiness of this one. No body, no clothing, no digital trail, no sign of struggle. It is as if Lauren stepped into a space that absorbed her completely. And yet disappearances do not happen in a vacuum. Something caused her to vanish. Something that night pushed events beyond recovery. As dawn broke over Bloomington, search teams spread out. Dogs sniffed through wooded areas. Helicopters scanned fields. Volunteers combed alleys and riverbanks. For days, then weeks, then months, Bloomington searched for a girl who never should have walked into the night alone. But no trace surfaced. The city held its breath, hoping for anything, even a fragment of truth. None came. The first part of this documentary ends where the investigation begins. A set of blurry camera frames, a barefoot girl disappearing into pre-dawn darkness, and a silence that grows louder every year. This was not just a disappearance. It was a sequence of preventable failures. A night where help was never called, where caution was never taken, and where fear of responsibility may have outweighed the value of a human life. I am Miller Files, and this is the beginning of the case that still refuses to rest. In Part 2, we follow the investigation hour by hour, examining who saw her last, what they claimed happened, and why their silence has become the loudest clue of all. When the sun rose over Bloomington on June 3, 2011, the town was quiet in a way that did not match what was unfolding beneath its surface. The search for Lauren Spierer had begun before most residents even stepped out of their homes. Parents were calling hospitals, roommates were retracing steps, and officers were already standing at the apartment complex where Lauren had been seen just hours earlier. A disappearance in a college town is never taken lightly, but this one was different from the start. There was no waiting period, no assumption that she had simply decided to stay elsewhere. The people who knew her felt something deeper, a sense that something had gone terribly wrong. In every investigation, the first 24 hours are where the truth is most fragile. People remember clearly at first, then the memories shift, tiny details drift, and silence begins to grow in the spaces where certainty once lived. I have seen this happen again and again, and I watched it happen in Lauren's case as the hours unfolded. The police began their timeline with the final image captured on camera. That grainy recording of Lauren walking barefoot down the street at 4:15 a.m., and they tried to stretch the thread backward. Who was with her? Why did she leave without shoes? Why didn't anyone intervene? The detectives knocked on apartment doors one by one. They spoke first with those who had been closest to Lauren that night. These were students, young men who claimed they had simply been trying to help a friend get home. They described the sequence of events with a practiced calmness, insisting that Lauren left of her own will and that they watched her walk away. Every investigator knows when a story has been rehearsed too cleanly. Real memories tremble, they wander, they contradict themselves. These stories, however, stayed remarkably neat, too neat, and within hours, each of these young men sought legal representation. That decision alone doesn't make anyone guilty. People panic. They fear blame. They want protection. But when the last people to see a missing woman alive all choose silence over cooperation, the investigation hits a wall before it truly begins. Detectives took note of it. So did Lauren's family. So did I. Meanwhile, the search radius widened. Volunteers moved in lines across empty lots and wooded paths. Police surveyed construction areas, drainage systems, abandoned houses, anywhere a small, injured person could have collapsed unseen. Bloomington is not a vast city, but it has pockets of darkness, small gaps where someone could disappear without leaving a trace. Daylight revealed none of them. As the sun climbed higher, the search teams grew more numerous. Posters bearing Lauren's face appeared on windows, telephone poles, and storefronts. The missing person network spread across Indiana within hours, and yet no one reported seeing her. The detectives returned to the people who had been with her that night, pressing gently but firmly, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. They wanted to know about her fall inside the second apartment. They wanted to know how hard she hit her head. They wanted to know why no ambulance was called. The responses were vague. Some said she barely stumbled. Others dismissed the injury entirely. No one agreed on the details, but they all agreed on one thing. The moment Lauren stepped outside, she was alone. I have investigated enough cases to know that this statement can mean two things. It can mean the truth, that she walked away and something happened beyond their control. Or it can mean protection, a coordinated effort to draw a line between themselves and the disappearance. In the absence of evidence, both interpretations remain standing side by side, neither strong enough to collapse the other. As the day wore on, investigators pulled surveillance footage from nearby cameras. Every inch of street within several blocks was analyzed frame by frame. There were fragments of movement here and there, indistinct shapes under dim lighting, but none that showed Lauren after her final confirmed appearance. It was as if she had walked into a blind spot of the entire city. Cameras that should have captured her did not. What should have been a clear trail turned into static and gaps. The detectives began to ask themselves the same question I would later ask. How does a person vanish on a street surrounded by technology designed to record everything? When investigators reached the first apartment Lauren had visited that night, they searched for signs of conflict, signs of illness, signs of illness, signs of panic. Nothing. The space looked untouched by anything as serious as a medical crisis. They moved on to the second apartment, looking for the injury described in shifting terms. Again, they found nothing definitive. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The truth can be wiped clean long before a detective arrives. By late afternoon, fatigue began to creep into the search teams. But urgency pushed them forward. Lauren had been missing for over 12 hours. If she had collapsed somewhere, her condition could be critical. If she had sustained a head injury, hours mattered. If someone had taken her, every minute slipping away was a minute closer to a point of no return. Yet, despite all the urgency, the leads remained thin, nearly transparent. That evening, Lauren's parents arrived in Bloomington. Their faces carried the weight of fear that only parents of missing children truly understand. They met with detectives, listened to the timeline, studied the map of Lauren's last known movements, and asked the questions the police could not yet answer. When did she last speak? Why did no one call for help? Who benefited from silence? Night returned to Bloomington, and the search continued under streetlights and flashlights and the quiet hum of patrol cars. The first 24 hours had passed, and not a single piece of physical evidence had emerged. I remember writing in my notes that night that the absence of evidence in a case like this is not neutral. It is directional. It points somewhere. It suggests intention. It suggests interference. Lauren did not simply wander into nothingness. Something stopped her path. Something interrupted the natural timeline. And whoever was closest to that moment carried answers they were not ready to give. Ends where the pressure on the investigation begins to tighten. The next phase would not just focus on where Lauren walked, but on what people said, what they withheld, and what contradictions began to surface. The clues would not be physical. They would be human, and human clues are the hardest to decode because they change every time someone chooses fear over truth. In Part 3, we move deeper into the inconsistencies, the strange gaps in testimony, the rising suspicion around those last with her, and the patterns that reveal more through silence than speech. In every disappearance, there comes a moment when the investigation stops moving forward through physical evidence and begins moving inward through human behavior. Part 3 of Lauren Spierer's case is where that shift becomes undeniable. It is where the inconsistencies begin to surface, not in the environment, but in the people closest to the final hours of her life. A missing person case is built from timelines, statements, and observations that must line up like gears in a clock. But in Lauren's case, the gears never aligned. They scraped and jammed and contradicted one another from the moment detectives began their questioning. The first and most important contradiction came from the accounts of the final witnesses. These were the young men who saw Lauren in her most vulnerable state. They insisted repeatedly that Lauren was simply intoxicated, that she was choosing her own movements, that they were bystanders to her decisions. Yet the same individuals acknowledged that she was unable to walk steadily, that she had suffered a fall inside one of the apartments, and that they chose not to call for medical assistance. This contradiction is subtle but damning. If Lauren was impaired enough to stumble, fall, and lose her belongings, why was she considered capable of making rational decisions about leaving alone at 4 in the morning? When detectives compared statements from the same night, the stories diverged. One person claimed she barely tripped. Another implied she may have hit her head with enough force to concern them. A third insisted the injury was nothing at all. The shifts were slight, but each shift told a story of uncertainty, not the natural uncertainty of memory, but the controlled uncertainty of someone trying to land on the safest version of events. And then came the silence. Within a day, each of these key individuals had lawyers speaking for them. They declined further questioning. They refused polygraph examinations. They ended their cooperation entirely. For detectives, Silence is not guilt, but it is pressure. It narrows the field. It forces the investigation to dig into the smallest behavioral details because no new information is being offered. It is often said that the truth fears no questions. The converse is equally true. Silence is only chosen when the answers carry danger. As the investigation pressed deeper, detectives revisited the timeline again and again. Lauren's last known location was only a few blocks from her apartment, a 5-minute walk. Under normal circumstances, she would have reached home safely. But these were not normal circumstances, and the question that investigators could not shake was simple. Did she ever truly leave that area alone? On video, she walks out of the frame, but frames do not tell the whole story. There were no cameras further down the street to confirm her path. There were no witnesses who saw her after that moment. The world goes dark around her. Search teams continued combing through nearby wooded areas, riverbeds, and construction sites. But something about the emptiness of the search troubled investigators. If Lauren had collapsed nearby, someone should have found her. Bloomington is not a wilderness. It is a structured town with sidewalks, buildings, and foot traffic. A person does not disappear without noise unless the disappearance did not happen in the open. Attention turned back to the apartments. Detectives returned multiple times, checking for any sign of a cleaning, disturbance, or panic. They looked for inconsistencies in the layout compared to descriptions in statements. They analyzed the timing between phone calls, texts, and movements of those present. They watched for gaps, periods of time unaccounted for, periods where explanations were vague or non-existent. Those gaps existed. They were small, but they mattered. In missing person cases, minutes can be the difference between coincidence and something worse. Lauren's parents, meanwhile, continued their public pleas. They met with investigators every day, reviewed maps, reread timelines, stared at the final grainy image of their daughter walking barefoot into darkness. They asked questions that rang through the department. Why was there no call for help? Why does no one know exactly when she fell? Why do the stories not match? Why did everyone stop talking? Detectives started to consider the possibility that the truth of that night existed in the spaces between the statements, not within them. When people speak carefully, they reveal as much through omission as they do through description. One person said they walked her to the door, but did not watch her leave. Another said they watched her from a window, but could not say which direction she turned. A third said they remembered hearing a door close, but could not confirm whether it was hers. Each detail was usable on its own, but together they formed a pattern of incomplete sentences. In my experience, when multiple witnesses speak in incomplete sentences, they are not remembering a moment, they are protecting one. A new suspicion formed among investigators that something may have happened inside one of those apartments that night. Something that no one wanted to articulate. It may not have been intentional harm. It may not have been violence. It could have been a medical emergency, an accident, a moment of fear, followed by a series of bad decisions. But whatever happened, it became clearer with each interview that the people present were more focused on minimizing their involvement than illuminating the truth. As days passed, the contradictions only deepened. Statements hardened as if rehearsed. The same exact phrasing appeared in different interviews, suggesting alignment among individuals who claimed they did not speak to one another. The public grew suspicious. Investigators grew frustrated. Silence grew louder. The search found nothing. Cadaver dogs detected no trace. Rivers turned up no evidence. Construction crews found nothing but debris. A disappearance without a body is rare. A disappearance without a single piece of physical evidence is almost unheard of. And yet, here we were. The contradictions became the evidence. Not the kind you can present in court, not the kind that leads to an arrest, but the kind that guides a detective's instinct. Something had happened to Lauren that night, something that required cooperation to hide or to misrepresent, something that everyone in that apartment wanted to distance themselves from as quickly as possible. Part 3 ends at the moment the investigation shifts from searching outward to searching inward, from looking for Lauren to looking into the people who last saw her alive. In Part 4, we step into the theories, accident, panic, concealment, and the possibility that the truth of the night was decided not by malice, but by fear. When a disappearance enters its fourth day without evidence, without sightings, without even a trace of physical disturbance, the investigation begins to bend under the weight of possibility. But possibility is a dangerous landscape. It stretches endlessly and contains every answer. And because it contains every answer, it provides none. Detectives must narrow the field, not by what is found, but by what cannot be denied. In Lauren Spierer's case, this narrowing led investigators into a set of theories that formed the backbone of the case, theories that arose not from discovery, but from absence. As the days passed, the detectives reviewed each possible scenario. They began with the simplest, that Lauren, intoxicated and vulnerable, suffered a medical emergency somewhere along her walk home and collapsed unnoticed. The heat of the early morning, combined with her heart condition and alcohol consumption, could have triggered a fatal arrhythmia. But this theory cracked under scrutiny. Bloomington is not wilderness. A collapsed student on a sidewalk or near a building would likely be seen within hours. The search teams had swept every open area repeatedly. There was nowhere for her to lie undetected unless she had wandered into a restricted zone or concealed space. And even then, the odds weakened with each passing day. The second theory was a stranger abduction. It was the least likely but not impossible. Late-night prowlers exist in every city, even quiet ones, but abductions involve risk, movement, noise, force. None of these elements appeared in the evidence. No screams were reported. No vehicles were seen fleeing. No suspicious individuals were identified in the hours surrounding Lauren's disappearance. A stranger abduction was possible, yes, but it lacked structure. It lacked the narrative gravity that such crimes usually leave behind. This led investigators toward the theory that grew darker, heavier, and harder to dismiss the longer they examined it. That something happened inside one of those apartments, and that Lauren never left the area alive. It was a theory built not on a single piece of proof, but on the friction between testimonies and the silence that followed them. Every detective knows that silence has shape. It has temperature. It has weight. And in this case, the silence was thick enough to reshape the investigation entirely. Investigators reviewed every statement again. They compared them line by line, word by word. The inconsistencies, once small, now formed a pattern. One individual said Lauren was coherent before leaving. Another said she could not stand without help. One said she walked out the door on her own. Another said she needed support. These contradictions might seem small to the untrained eye, but to a detective they shine like fractures in glass, each pointing toward a moment of impact hidden beneath the surface. And then there was the question of the fall. What exactly happened inside the apartment? The severity shifted in every retelling. A stumble, a light trip, a possible head strike. In missing person investigations, head injuries are some of the most lethal, not because of the injury itself, but because they create confusion, disorientation, and internal trauma that is invisible until it is too late. If Lauren suffered such an injury and no one called for medical intervention, she could have slipped into unconsciousness within minutes. Panic could have followed. Decisions could have spiraled. And once panic takes hold, logic cracks. Fear becomes the architect of behavior. The fourth theory, that Lauren died accidentally and her death was concealed, emerged from this line of thinking. It was not official. It was not proven. It was a shadow on the wall of the case, growing larger as the days went on. If an accident occurred, especially under the influence of alcohol or drugs, those present may have feared criminal charges. They may have feared scandal, consequences, imprisonment. Fear, when combined with youth, intoxication, and sudden crisis, can twist judgment beyond recognition. This theory gained momentum because it explained what the others could not: the absolute absence of evidence. Disappearances that occur outdoors leave marks: clothing, fibers, footprints, drag marks, discarded belongings. But an indoor incident, especially one followed by intentional concealment, can eliminate traces before sunrise. A car trunk, a dumpster, a remote rural area, these possibilities haunted the investigation. Each was both plausible and devastating. Meanwhile, the public grew restless. Rumors spiraled. Social media lit up with accusations, theories, and anger, but the investigators stayed grounded. They could not afford to chase speculation. They needed patterns, logic, behavior. And the behaviors surrounding the individuals from that night continued to draw attention. They refused further interviews. They declined polygraphs. They avoided public appeals. They distanced themselves emotionally and physically from the case. These choices did not prove guilt, but they dimmed the light of innocence. Lauren's parents were now living in a state of suspended grief. They met with police daily, searching for hope that the investigation could still break open. They studied maps of Bloomington, memorized every street, every alley, every possible route their daughter might have taken. They looked at the apartments where she spent her final hours, wondering why no one had protected her, why no one had intervened, why the people who were closest to her suffering now seemed so distant. In these meetings, detectives shared their theories carefully. They could not accuse without evidence. They could not promise answers they did not have. But they could share the truth of the investigation's direction, the uncomfortable shift from searching fields and rivers to analyzing behavior and psychology. It is one of the hardest transitions in detective work, telling a family that you are no longer searching for their daughter in the world, but in the words and actions of the people she trusted. Part 4 ends at a crossroads where theories are no longer abstract but necessary. The investigation stands between what might have happened outdoors and what might have happened behind closed doors. One possibility fits the evidence. The other fits the silence. In Part 5, the final chapter, we follow the investigation into its present day, the cold case strategies, the unanswered questions, and the haunting reality that in some disappearances, the truth is buried not in the earth, but in the minds of those who refuse to speak. A cold case is not defined by time. It is defined by silence. Time only deepens the quiet, but the true coldness comes from the unanswered questions that circle a disappearance like shadows that refuse to fade. In the case of Lauren Spierer, the silence did not begin years later. It began within days. It began when the voices that could have filled the void chose instead to step away from it. And as weeks turned into months and months into years, the investigation entered a state that every detective knows too well: the long freeze where hope and reality collide in the narrowest of spaces. Weeks after Lauren vanished, Bloomington had returned to its daily rhythm, at least on the surface. But beneath that routine lived a persistent ache, a reminder that a young woman had walked into the pre-dawn darkness and never walked back out. Detectives continued to receive tips, some sincere, some misguided, some cruel. Each was investigated. None held weight. Search teams expanded their radius. They combed rural land, checked abandoned wells, searched rivers, ravines, cornfields. The effort was relentless, almost desperate. And yet every lead dissolved into nothing. Lauren's parents refused to let the case fade. They remained in Indiana for months, meeting with investigators, walking the routes their daughter might have taken, speaking to the press, pleading with those who knew what happened to come forward. They established foundations, continued awareness campaigns, and refused to let Lauren's name be swallowed by time. But grief has its own gravity. It does not weaken with distance. It presses harder, demanding answers that the world cannot or will not provide. The investigators, meanwhile, shifted into what we call the reconstruction phase. When evidence is scarce, you reconstruct behavior, you reconstruct psychology, you revisit every minute, every exchange, every silence. You look for fault lines between words and truth. One detective described it as walking through fog while searching for a whisper. And yet, within that fog, certain realities remained constant. Lauren did not simply walk away. She did not start a new life. She did not vanish through chance alone. Something intervened. Something human. Over the years, officers returned multiple times to the same individuals, hoping time would loosen their restraint. Sometimes time shakes truth free, cracks guilt, or inspires conscience. But in this case, the silence only hardened. Statements remained unchanged. Lawyers remained present. Boundaries remained firm, and the absence of cooperation became, in its own unsettling way, a form of evidence. Not evidence that solves a case, but evidence that frames it. The apartment buildings from that night still stand in Bloomington. Students continue to move in and out, unaware that walls around them once held the final known hours of a missing woman. Surveillance footage from the area has been studied more times than any detective can count. More than a decade later, investigators still rewatch the final recorded image of Lauren, a small figure moving unsteadily down a quiet street, unaware that she is walking off the edge of the known world. That single image has become the anchor of a case with no shoreline. Cold case detectives later pursued new strategies. They interviewed former friends turned distant acquaintances. They analyzed old statements with new psychological techniques. They ran updated forensic searches using more advanced cadaver dogs, hoping for even the faintest biological trace. They requested landfill records, cell tower reconstructions, and access to digital archives that didn't exist in 2011. They worked backward through every trash pickup route in Bloomington for the days following Lauren's disappearance, a gruesome but necessary task. Still, nothing. And yet, despite the lack of physical evidence, the theory of accidental death followed by concealment continued to dominate the investigative landscape. Not because detectives wanted it to be true, but because it fit the behavior, it fit the silence, it fit the contradictions of that night better than any other explanation. If Lauren had died accidentally inside one of those apartments, everything that happened afterward, the panic, the retreat, the legal shielding, the refusal to speak, became terribly, painfully understandable. Not excusable, never excusable, but understandable. Years passed, students graduated, administrators changed, investigators retired. But the case did not. It lived on in the hands of cold case units, in the hearts of Lauren's family, in the files that remain open on shelves that hold stories without endings. I have walked past those shelves many times. Each binder has a weight that is not paper alone. Lauren's file is heavier than most, not because of its contents, but because of its emptiness. Emptiness, when it should be full, is its own form of burden. Lauren's parents still wait. They still speak her name. They still ask the questions that echo across more than a decade of searching. What happened to our daughter? Who was with her in her final moments? Why won't they tell us the truth? These are questions no investigation can answer until silence breaks. And silence, in this case, has been unbroken for far too long. Part 5 ends not with resolution, but with reality. Some cases remain cold because the evidence is gone. Others remain cold because the truth is held hostage by fear, loyalty, guilt, or shame. The disappearance of Lauren Spierer belongs to this latter category. It is a case not buried under earth, but buried under silence. As a detective, I know that truth has a way of resurfacing. It may take time. It may take a confession, a slip, a change of heart, or a shift in conscience. But truth waits. It does not decay. It does not vanish. It sits inside the people who carry it. Like a weight they cannot set down. Until someone speaks, the case will remain where it has been since that night in June, frozen in the space between what we know and what we almost know. And I, Miller Files, will continue to follow it. Not because I expect the silence to break today, but because every cold case deserves someone still listening in the dark.